Ceci est un livre audio autogénéré par Google. Entre Apocalypse et Rédemption. L'écriture de Gloria Naylor. Writing in Between Apocalypse and Redemption. Gloria Naylor's fiction. Texte réuni par Emmanuel Andrès, Claudine Reynaud, Suzette Tanisplant. Entre Apocalypse et Rédemption. L'écriture de Gloria Naylor. Writing in Between Apocalypse and Redemption. Gloria Naylor's fiction. Sélection des actes du Colloque international de Tours, 10 juin 2005. Jeu 2450, études afro-américaines. L'Harmattan. Études africaines-américaines et diasporiques. African American et Diasporic Studies. Collection bilingue Bilingual Collection. Dirigée par Marc MVE accent aigu Bécal, Hélène Le Dantec-Laurie et Harriet Frund. La présente collection accueille toutes les études touchant au domaine africain-américain et aux nouvelles interactions littéraires, culturelles et politiques entre l'Afrique et sa diaspora. Elle encourage des travaux ouverts à l'interdisciplinarité. The present French-English collection welcomes all scholarly studies in the African-American field as well as research works addressing the new literary, cultural and political dynamics between Africa and its diaspora. We particularly encourage cross-disciplinary works. Ouvrage déjà paru. Christine Dual. Les Noirs et la réussite universitaire aux États-Unis, 2008. Marc MVE Bezeka ALE. Traite négrière et expérience du temps dans la littérature américaine, 2007. Introduction. APSAINSTAKING, ELOQUENCE. Emmanuel Andrès, Université de La Rochelle et de Tours. Claudine Reynaud, CNRS, Université de Tours. Suzette Tanisplant, INRA, Université de Tours. The author of 6 novels as well as the editor of an anthology of African American literature, Gloria Naylor, B. 1950, represents the generation of black women writers whose vocation was made possible by the success of their literary foremothers. In numerous interviews, Naylor explicitly states that reading Toni Morrison's The Blue Sky was an epiphany. It showed her that writing was a feasible endeavor for a black woman. The Blue Sky is the beginning. The presence of the work served two vital purposes at that moment in my life. It said to a young poet, struggling to break into prose, that the barriers were flexible. At the core of it all is language, and if you are skilled enough with that, you can create your own genre. It said a young black woman, struggling to find a mirror of her work in society. Not only is your story worth telling, but it can be told in words so painstakingly eloquent that it becomes a song. Montgomery, 2004-11. It authorized her to take the pen and make it her living. Naylor is the recipient of numerous national awards, including the American Book Award for the Best First Novel. Yet hers is also a popular success. The Women of Brewster Place, 1982, was a bestseller that was made into a television film directed by Donna Detch, 1989, and starring Oprah Winfrey and Cecily Tizon. The play based on Belle's Café, 1992, was staged by the Hartford Stage Company in the spring of 1993. Although scholars have made her the object of intense critical attention since she started publishing, the quality and the scope of Naylor's work require renewed scrutiny in and of itself their interest has primarily focused on the major women writers of the New Black Renaissance such as Morrison, Alice Walker, Tonika Bambara, and Paul Marshall, while Naylor was often viewed in comparison or in contrast to them. Naylor was in very good company indeed, yet certain facets of a writer's oeuvre only emerge when it is placed squarely at the center of one's reflection. In 2004, the publication of Conversation with Gloria Naylor at the University of Mississippi Press consecrated Naylor's literary career with a collection of her interviews. At that juncture, the purpose of the 2005 Tours Conference, from which most of the following articles have emerged, was to map out the fictional space of this major African-American woman writer and to assess the tensions that run through her work from The Women of Brewster Place to 1996, founded upon the premise that Naylor's fiction hovers between the antithetical pole of apocalypse and redemption. Scholars investigated inscription of violence in her writing. The thrust of the research focused on a central question. How does Naylor write in between doom and salvation? Several scholars first set out to circumscribe the imaginary spaces within Naylor's writing as well as reveal the numerous ways they reflect the concept of apocalypse and redemption, thereby setting the scene for violence between the protagonists. Because Naylor's writing is often set in a dense spiritual context, other scholars focused on the connotation of apocalypse and redemption, to place en emphasis on the sacred in its relation to the imaginary. The concept of holiness, however, cannot be encompassed in mere religiosity, and the sense of mystery and alienation endowed by sacredness is all too present in Naylor's secular, at times profane, writing. This sense of otherness may partly explain why the insistence on the body takes on a different slant in Naylor's writing. Question arose concerning the violence suffered by the gendered body, in particular, and they also bore on textual poetics, on the violence of the writing itself. More specifically, some scholars asked, how does violence enter Naylor's writing? If the territories of Naylor's imagination are interwoven with powerful intertext, what is then the place of that other heritage these other sit in the creation of the antithetical tension? These initial interrogation led to unexpected findings when reading Naylor's latest book, 1996, or placing one of her novels in relation to a film by a contemporary black female filmmaker. Perhaps one of the seats resides in the materiality of the text, in the very construction of the narrative voices. In between 1996 and Mama Day, tension is created between the chaos of voices battling in one's mind as a result of electronic surveillance and the saving voice that can be claimed as one's own. The passage a scholar took to explore Naylor's œuvre in light of all these interrogations is as follows. In her article, Gloria Naylor's Bell's Café, a panic reading of Bell's narrative, Angela DePace gives dimension to the two particular spaces created by the author in that book, by putting an emphasis on the void that abut Bell's Café and Eve's Garden that bloom profusely in all seasons. DePace, in a way similar to, but not quite like Florentine Rosca, speaks of these places that signify of recuperative space. DePace explains that the café becomes a place for some to take, a breather for a while, the edge of the world frightening as it is could be the end of the world. BC 28. As for the garden, it has been the best garden around since Paradise was lost. However, a DePace arg, what he finally recuperated at these two imaginary places are the narrative of Belle, Sadie, Eve, Esther, Peaches, Jezebel and Stanley. Indeed, out of that recuperative space arises a resemblance of history, wherein Naylor explodes to smithereens any black-white delusional desire not to view racism in the latter part of the 20th century as a catastrophe comparable to the atomic bombing and the Jewish Holocaust diaspora. Rosea begins her reading of Mama Day and Bell's Café by pointing out that careful consideration of spaces, whether geographical, communal or supernatural, and the people inhabiting them are hallmark of Naylor's fiction. Compared to The Women of Brewster Place and Linden Hills, Rosca finds that, in the novel's understudy, insistence is laid on open spaces, be they either the enchanted island in Mama Day or the café at the edge of the world in Bell's Café. These are new and different spatial configurations well worth investigating to better understand the overall topography of Naylor's novels. Rosca explores the creation of these phantasmagorical worlds, as well as their position and strategic function in the narrative act. No matter how much information the narrator gives the reader to locate these places, they remain ambiguous. The stories are set on islands of indeterminacy. Both are, in the final analysis, imaginary islands, where the boundary between myth and reality is an indistinct and evasive one. They are signifying spaces that validate the experience of the protagonist. Germaine Gessan bases his reading of Mama Day on the fact that one of the most recurrent themes in contemporary African-American women's novels is a legitimate will to reconnect with the ancestral land. et juxtapose elements found in African culture and those used by Naylor in Mama Day to explore how Naylor's narrative stage, the reconstruction of an authentic African culture and thereby reflect this desire. E argue that although Naylor's fictive universe is far from the day-to-day life of Africans, she nevertheless tries to recreate what amount to a queer cultural space. From the cult of the ancestor to naming, to sacrifice, to the supernatural powers of the heroine, a place for African culture is established. Nonetheless, it concludes that the Africa the novel establishes is strikingly similar to the one African Americans learn about in history books and from the oral tradition of their community. Naylor's Africa is thus a product of collective memory and imagination, with an indirect link to the reality of the Black continent. If the line cannot be easily drawn between reality and imaginary spaces in Naylor's fiction, other confusion pervade her tale of trauma and survival from the women of Brewster Place to 1996. The body, in illness and sex, becomes the very locus of paradox and ambiguity, the textual site where everything can be told. In her paper, Claudia Drillin explores the health versus illness paradigm in Naylor's second novel, Linden Hills, where Western standards of bodily health do not apply, epitomized in the rendering of the identities and experience of two dramatically different characters. However, while Norman Anderson and Maxwell Smith both go through profound bodily change affecting, respectively, their sense of color and purity, the issue Drillin addresses goes well beyond race, caste and gender. In her in-depth analysis of what she calls a cultural narrative of systemic illness, she questions the very notion of health in a world which has somehow veered away from the traditional African-American notion of community as well as the humanist ideal of acceptance and tolerance, as Naylor's symptomatic characters exemplify. Taking up the ever-paradoxical notion of purity, Emmanuelle Andrès focuses her attention on the women of Brewster Place and Belle's Café, as well as Toni Morrison's Paradise. Purity and impurity are posited as the two poles of a large notion of the sacred, notwithstanding the fact that in these two novels the line between pure agents and impure victims is not easily drawn. It is Andrès' conviction that the sacred, that which one cannot approach without dying, Kaiwa 25, is at the very heart of the novels. Various scapegoats or sacrificed pariahs are the necessary agents of purification, as well as the conveyor of transcendence in an otherwise apocalyptic world. Andrès furthers her analysis by developing how Naylor's writing is, in and of itself, sacred territory. The ultimate sacrifice is the craft of the book, engaging the reader on a cathartic journey. In Morrison's case, Andrès argue, the text inspire a WES it is a mysterium tremendum which is part and parcel of the holy process of telling and expiating. Ambiguity certainly pervade most instances of heterosexual union in Naylor's fiction. A Patricia Curjato point out in her analysis of Naylor's five main novels, The Women of Brewster Place, The Men of Brewster Place, Belle's Café, Linden Hills and Mama Day. Though the war of the sexes is not always clearly waged, even seemingly peaceful unions are not devoid of violence or strife affecting women and men, but also their offspring and, to a large extent, the homes they live in. The feminine, matriarchal element of the home is forever threatened in Naylor's fiction. Curjato convey, there is no place for viable relationships whether homo or heterosexual in her novels. Imaginary space is no ideal place for reconciliation and or a strong line of love. Rich, 1976, 246. As a result, bodily responses, always already in the making, inscribe themselves into Naylor's texts as a testimony of a deeper malaise left unsaid ever so unsettling, perhaps all too present. Her fiction, however, is undeniably and unexpectedly vocal. Voices, the voices of other text critics explore the rich intertextuality of Naylor's fiction. The voice inscribed in the materiality of the text, in Mama Day, Rima's song actually tap the voices of the Highlanders, and the voices inscribed in the writer's min-by-min monitoring, in 1996, are the subject of the third and last section. Each time, the issue of power relation and silencing is paramount, and the final essay frames their responses within a context of black women's creativity vis-à-vis the supremacy of male knowledge and technology. Most specifically, Naylor's last novel to date offers an investigation into apocalypse and redemption, a single battle of this world to save the voice that is rewriting oppression from a black female perspective. A specialist of Shakespeare and a Morrison scholar, Annie-Paul Miel de Prinsac analyse the ways in which Naylor's Mama Day inscribe direct reference to Shakespeare's King Lear and other echoes of The Tempest. She also assesses Othello's influence on the text. She finds this fragmented intertext puzzling, in part because of Naylor's over feminist agenda, but also she finally ventures, in light of the writer's former religious career a Jehovah's Witness. At first King Lear is an element in George and Cocoa's sexual parade as well as a badge of integration into white culture and society. The character of George recalls the bastard Edmund, but is in fact closer to King Lear. Like him, he is eventually led to the vileness of nature, and like him, he is defeated. Willow Springs can be seen as a remake of Prospero's Island, where Prospero's part is played by an old woman, Miranda, alias Mama Day. Yet George, unlike Ferdinand, does not stand the test of Mama Day's requirement. The magic of the island does not work on him. The interpenetration of King Lear and the Tempest render him responsible for his own demise. In Mama Day, woman's redemption ultimately happens at man's expense. Suzette Tani Plant's article explores how Gloria Naylor and the African-American filmmaker Julie Dash contribute to a debate over new language tools to dismantle the master's house, Lord 98. Proceeding by intertextual resonance, Tani Plant used Dash's film Illusion, 1983, as a means to come to a better understanding of what new tools Naylor is proposing. The voice in film and novels is a construction in the hands of men, a crucial mechanism in building knowledge and prompting the power that goes with it. At the position of enunciation, Dash and Naylor are shown to be retooling the voice. In fact, Tani Plant argues that Dash and Naylor posit what amount to a new paradigm of how the voice can function. As such, the voice is a saving grace in the otherwise apocalyptic worlds of Mama Day and Illusion. Both women artists propose a model that account for listening as well as speaking, and that bridge the gap between the diegetic world and the phenomenal one, i.e., the difference between the speaking women of color in the story and us, the readers' viewers. The model opens a space for the challenging discourse of women of color and a space for listening to them. If you listen carefully, you will realize that the voice you hear is your own, MD this. This formalistic innovation go hand in hand with the dismantling of the master's house that the texts call for. In effect, Naylor and Dash propose nothing less than a transfigured vision of American democracy. 1996-2005, Naylor's novel Memoir that is par fiction par fact is based on the harassment Naylor declares she suffered from when she retired to her house on St. Helena's Island to work on a new novel. This surveillance is depicted as a result of a neighbor's brawl that escalated into mind monitoring. The book managed to denounce a discurtailment of individual rights while Naylor, by using herself as the main character, confused the reader and the critic. Did all this happen to her or did she suffer a nervous breakdown or both? Moreover, so deftly played out is the confusion that readers are left with an uncertainty that they may turn back on themselves. Claudine Reynaud's article shows that the generic choice of the blend between fiction and non-fiction necessarily and purposefully leaves that issue unsettled. Partly autofictional, 1996 also presents a fictional fragment that makes the novel read a spy story or a James Bond adventure. Intertextual elements with reference to Orwell's 1984 and Naylor's other works further contribute to the fictionalization of the memoir. However, the harassment, which is depicted so convincingly backed as it is by actual documents, leads the reader to suspend any disbelief. Reynaud also explores the link between paranoia, autobiography and race at the core of the book. Paranoia, she argues, is both the substance and the form of the text. The main character, self-named Gloria Naylor, and the other protagonist, her neighbor and the fictional government agent, all suffer from paranoid disorders. The structure and the writing endlessly mirror the condition induced by harassment. The technology itself reproduces the splitting of the self and provokes the delusion that characterizes this pathology. The appended text, a lawsuit and an online article, restore the real of other case, work a modem day authenticating document, and testify to the widespread practice of surveillance and mean monitoring. The conclusion takes up Naylor's own statement that writing that book was a means to escape from insanity. In the case of 1996, the novel memoir is both crusade and catharsis. In Naylor's imaginary world, violence permits the spaces and the place, interpersonal relationships, the body and the mind. Writing, then, occurs at the edge, as a result of a fight against fear, panic, paranoia, and the narrative works are a reassuring force to counter this vision of the end of the world. The voices you hear might not be your own, but the very act of writing them and shaping them create a phantasmagoric world in between apocalypse and redemption. The act of writing is terribly a sacred territory. It is an act of salvation. Works cited. Caillois, Roger. 1950. L'homme et le sacré. Paris Gallimard. Montgomery, Maxine Lavon, ed. 2004. Conversation with Gloria Naylor. Jackson, University Press of Mississippi. Lord Audrey. 1981. The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. In This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color ed. Sherry Moraga, and Gloria Ansaldois. Waterton, Ma. Persephone Press 98 à 191. Morrison, Tony. 2003. Love. New York Knopf. Rich, Adrienne. 1976. Of Woman Born Motherhood a Experience and Institution. New York Norton. 1 Imaginary Spaces. Gloria Naylor's Bell's Café, A Panic, Reading of Bell's Narrative 2. Angela DIPACE. Sacred Art University. This reading of Gloria Naylor's Bell's Café, 1992, focuses on the aftermath of the catastrophe of slavery in America as it continued to be played out at the end of the 20th century. By foregrounding the catastrophe of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Bell's narrative and juxtaposing them to the subsequent narrative of Sadie, Eve, Esther, Peaches, Jezebel, and Stanley, Naylor puts under erasure habitualized and automatized responses to the catastrophe of slavery and its aftermath. Nested, as they are between the atomic bombing, Bell's narrative, at the beginning of the novel and the aftermath of a Jewish Holocaust and diaspora, Gabby's and Miriam's narrative, at the end of the novel the narrative function as a mise en abîme. In this sense, the narrative are situated between two large sign systems, the atomic bombing and the Holocaust diaspora, and what at first might have seemed to be a lesser sign, the narrative, becomes a large sign that opens to the void, BC 76 and Passim, that abuts the café. As such, the narrative, a embedded representation of two largest signs, may seem less catastrophic, yet they resemble the largest signs in their shared brutality and devastatingly far-reaching consequences. This resemblance, moreover, enlarges the narrative as a sign of enormity equal to that of the others. Such a configuration of figure structure of the text renders the narrative as a large sign system of the catastrophe of institutionalized racism, the aftermath of slavery. Thus, Naylor explodes to smithereens any black-white delusional desire not to view racism in the latter part of the 20th century as a catastrophe comparable to the atomic bombing and the Jewish Holocaust diaspora. Viewed from this perspective, the wounds and screams that underscore the character narrative of Broken Dreams, BC 144, and Broken-Heartedness, Bible and Culture Collective, 1995-300, emerge from the catastrophic damage of racism in post-slavery America. Reflecting on Sadie's tragic narrative, Belle is moved to state. My father used to tell me that a star dies in heaven every time you snatch away someone's dream. Dreams had been dying around Sadie all of her life, BC 64. Dreams have been snatched and dying for all the characters who, except for Gabe who is a white Falasha, BC 159, and Miriam who is an Ethiopian Jew, BC 143 and Passim, are African American and who find Bell's Café void, stay at Eve's boarding house, or stop in front of Gabby's pawn shop. Like a flock of wounded doves screaming, BC 90, they temporarily alight in one of these three places shifting signifié of recuperative space. One needs only to point with the reverberating refrain, a response to Daddy Jim about peaches. Leave your daughter here F says and I'll return her to you all, BC 113 and Passim. Or do Naylor's conceptualization, spatialization of the café void to localize her intertextual project of a hermeneutics of recuperation. Early on, Bailey inform the readers that the previous owner knew that this place had to be real mobile, BC 28, because, even though this planet is round, there are just too many spots where you can find yourself hanging at the edge just like he was, and unless there's some space, some place, to take a breather for a while, the edge of the world frightening it could be the end of the world, BC 28. Bailey is behind the grill, for the same reason that they keep coming, BC 4. For some, the café may be the last place before the end of the world, BC 68. Whereas for others, it may be the place space of infinite possibility, BC 76. The back door that open out to avoid, BC 76. For Miriam, the only one who plunged into the void, it is a wall of water, a running stream to bat in. And the void out back produced exactly what her childlike mind called up, endless water, BC 228. The other characters, however, are poised on the edge of aggression and terror, unable to dismount, caught in the imploding vortex. The black hole of paranoid politics, Crocker and Cook, 1991, 3. That advocates institutionalized racism, actualized in the dominant will to power and oppression, and perceptible in such dead-end signs as patriarchy, misogyny, and abuse all needed to subjugate African Americans, women, and others on the margin. Except for the pioneering Hugh Masco BC 167, and her black husband, Stanley's paternal grandparents, she who managed to survive the genocide, BC 173, of her people and who escaped enslavement in 1849, many of the black-white minor characters replicate racist behavior institutionalized by the dominant, avid in the pathetic, BC 183, Whites and Ku Klux Klan, BC 176, members de Gatlin St. Peters, patriarchy, Godfather and Daddy Jim, misogynie et leaking the nag, BC 96, and the pervers abusé of Esther. Homophobia, Sugarman and leaking, servitude, le Van Morrisons, le pimp, etc. Hypocrisie, répression, Sister Carrie, and other signs of systematic vilification are suffered by Stanley and inflicted upon him by all who may encounter at a university, the prison and the corporate world. The other characters suffer not only from broken dreams and broken hearts, but also from broken spirit. Their bodies have become a spatialized field whose boundaries are freely pierced by subatomic particles in the microphysics of power, Crocker and Cook, 1991, v. There are fractal bodies and fractal entities, recycled signs of racism, Crocker and Cook, 1991, v. Given a breather, BC 28. They may create themselves from the onslaught of a racist society and therefore create infinite possibility BC 76, or they may step at the edge of the world, BC 68, into the annihilating simulacrum that has been created for them. Even though this reading focuses on Bailey's narrative, a text's polysmy and its polyphonic texture do not privilege its narrative. In fact, all the narratives are equally significant and are interconnected. One does not colonize nor marginalize the other. By its very nature, a polyphonic text cannot be reducible to a single voice unity, single concept, or a univocity of meaning. The Bible and Culture Collective, 1995, 129, 132. But nobody comes in this café, caution Bailey, with a simple story. Everyone learner's got a life underneath it. Every point's got a counterpoint, BC 34. Adding that, anything really worth hearing in this greasy spoon happens under the surface, BC 35. It is the under the surface of Bailey's specific experience that frames the other narratives mise en abîme and that elicit a panic reading. Crocker and Cook, 1991, 2. Bailey's specific experience is replete with sign crime, BC 37 and Passim that haunt the entire text, as well as the last decade of the 20th century. The A-bomb BC 23, dropped on Hiroshima BC 26, and the second atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki BC 26, situate the novel within the nihilistic conditions that, in part, characterize the postmodern and, thus, post-slavery American culture. Belle's Pacific narrative produce a kind of reading that is a way of participating directly in the ruins within and without of late 20th century experience. Crocker and Cook, 1991, 2. Favors than 10 page, mostly italicized to convey subjectivity and embedded in the first section of the novel, Maestro, if you please, pertain to Belle's story of his 3 years stint in the Navy, where he learned to cook and kill. Yet, Naylor's writing in test page, if black marks that bleed on white page, is extremely powerful and memorable because it is disturbing and unsettling for the reader, thus calling for a panic reading, which thrusts the reader into the void. Belle's Pacific experience locate repeatable signs of cruelty and brutality that having occurred during World War II, portant a grim future that he actualized in the oppressive present of the narrative but symbolically extends to the second half of the 20th century. The catastrophe of slavery and World War II have occurred, but what Belle's metonymy for militarists, warmongers, and racists did not take into account is a which catastrophe would affect the unborn children, BC 26, in addition to the million annihilated, maimed, and transfigured. It takes hundreds of killings before Belle is cognizant of his complicity in the catastrophe and the aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Similarly, it has taken more than 100 years for some individuals to recognize their complicity in the catastrophe of slavery and racism, while many remain willfully ignorant. Belle's trajectory in the Pacific, then, is emblematic of this process of recognition misrecognition. In the second paragraph of the novel, Belle lets the reader know that the café may be the seat of his PhD in progress, majoring in life, BC 3, but that the Pacific was the seat of his first diploma, BC 3. Not until drafted in 1942 did World War II register a more than newspaper headlines. Once realized that he was to be shipped to the Pacific, however, he was able to say that nobody missed the meaning of Pearl Harbor, BC 20. Hoodwinked to think that World War II would be a window of opportunity for African Americans, Belle quickly learns that Navy life replicate pre-World War II American society. Segregation is alive and well, are Jim Crow and the reductive attitude toward African American accomplishment, exemplified in the case of Dory Miller, who was the Satchel Paige of the War in the Pacific, BC 20. Two other allusions to the Pacific War actually predate Belle's marriage to Nadine. The first refers to winning the war against the Japanese, to his impending nervous breakdown, and to Nadine's threatening letter proposal, the one-line letter, "If you don't make it home, I'm marrying the butcher." Love Nadine BC 13. The second explicitly point to the fear of marriage, a man palsied with fear, BC 18, and plunge Belle into his war experience. In a long sentence that reflects this fear of entrapment, there is a parenthetical disjuncture. But the next few minutes are going to be the worst of my life, I had yet to meet the Japanese. BC 18 emphasis mean. The Pacific experience, then unfold not a flashback nor retrospection, but a analepsis, a term coined by Gérard Genette. The analepsis ensures that these events are to be read a purposive parallelism to the subsequent narrative to remove automatism, and thus, to effect an automatized response to the crime sign of racism. Belle's Pacific experience and the trace of World War II throughout the novel are instances of internal analepsis pointing to a time within that of the whole narrative. The Bible and Culture Collective, 1995, 74 and Passim. Since the events in Belle's story might have been introduced at a later point in the timeline of the novel, which span from 1849, BC 167, to 1949, BC 216, their placement at the beginning functions to foreground racism in the subsequent narrative. Basic training indoctrinated Belle into the credo of killing the other. Who you gonna kill? We're gonna kill Japs. Louder. Japs. Japs. Louder. Japs. Japs. Who you gonna fuck? We're gonna fuck Japs. Louder BC 21. It is not surprising that this seduction of war and death spills into many books written about war. In Pacific Destiny by Edwin Peoit, for example, the epigraph of one of the chapters reads, "Kill Japs. Kill Japs. Kilmore Japs. 1981, 167. That signing, right out above the fleet landing at Tulagi and was painted on the building at the headquarters in Noumea and Admiral Halsey closed every letter with the slogan, 1981, 167. In this book and others similar to it, the ideological indoctrination that takes place during basic training camouflage a systemic military science of oppression, destruction and death. In Guadalcanal Belay does his own killing, but it is also at this juncture that Estat has stopped calling those people Japs, BC 22. Why? First because as the Americans and Allied force had pushed back the Japanese inch by inch, island by island, BC 23, Belay learned they had been on the winning side long before the A-bomb was dropped, BC 23. Knowing this, Belay, nonetheless, continued to participate in a prolonged massacre prior to reaching the enemy's land, BC 23, are reinforced by the iteration of whoever getting into Tokyo, BC 21, repeated 5 times. Secondly, Belay begins to perceive that the concept of difference has nothing ontological about it. It is only the way that the master interprets a historical situation of domination. The function of difference is to mask at every level the conflict of interest, including ideological ones, Wittig 1996 408. Internalizing the militaristic slogan of following orders and fighting like a man, Belay contributes to the horror of war. As the troops get closer to Tokyo, the killing and destruction escalate and are concretized in Belay's catalogue of atrocities equal in horror to the atrocities that took place during the Jewish Holocaust. He blasts every island, he burns the enemy alive, and he witnesses the explosion of 100 entry, BC 25. Nothing can eradicate the scene at Saipan, a family picnic. All batted. New clothes, BC 25. At Okinawa, BC 25, one last island before Japan, BC 25, Belay becomes shell-shocked. I shoot up the palm of my hand and spat out the blood to keep from dozing at night. I could stop myself from sleeping, so there would be no dreams, BC 25. Having decimated hundreds of Japanese, BC 22 à 28, Belay realizes that he could not face the very young, the deformed, and the old, BC 25, who were waiting in Tokyo. Doomed to know that he was to survive catastrophes that could have been prevented, Belay confronts his own private hell. His anguish is augmented by the bargain he has made to come out alive, BC 26, take this cross from me. And yes, he offered any God who would answer even the rights to my unborn children. And the only God to answer claims them, BC 26. Belay's will to survive destroys the life of others. He gain nothing but lose all in his bargain to live. Hiroshima in exchange for my soul and then Nagasaki, BC 26. Belay, fearing for his immortal soul, BC 23, could not march into Tokyo to confront the evil he had helped to set loose upon the world. On August 6, 1945, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, 100,000 people were killed, RZ 1989, 2. In his heart-rendering account Hiroshima, published first in 1946 and updated in 1989, John RZ chronicles the life of 6 survivors and revisits them 40 years later. Many of the survivors, the Hibakusha, literally meaning explosion-affected persons, RZ 1989, 92, were not only maimed physically, psychologically and spiritually, but they also were ostracized, forgotten and neglected. The Japanese militarists also helped to bring out this catastrophe, RZ 1989, 93. In Toward the Unknowable Future, The Introduction to the Crazy Iris, 1985, a collection of short stories about the atomic bombing and their aftermath and written by survivors and second-generation writers, Ken Zaburo writes that although the massive wreckage of life, limb, and livelihood caused by the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was for single bomb attacks unprecedented in human history, many of the second-generation survivors, children of those directly affected, were the first to acknowledge clearly that Japan and the Japanese were aggressors in the Pacific War that brought on the atomic bombing, 1985, 9. Ultimately, the short stories in The Crazy Iris and Belay's Cafe question both the American and Japanese government's responsibilities for the atomic bombing, 1985, 10. Additionally, however, Naylor questions the American government's responsibility for slavery and racism. Although political initiatives to abolish all nuclear arms have been put into effect internationally, no such claim can be made for the eradication of racism. In Belle's Café, Naylor advances the project by clearly exposing the markers of the marginalized, devalued, discounted, and discredited who are affected by the catastrophe of racism, as the Hibakusha were affected by the atomic bombing. Can love exist among the ruins? Can life exist? Can flowers bloom? Despite the horrific narrative of broken life and global devastation, Naylor is a proponent of affirmation and hope. There is love between Belle and Nadine, even marriage. Miriam gives birth to George. And then there is Eve's garden blooming profusely in all seasons. Eve's garden is a recuperative at Belle's Café. Her flowers even grow out of season as a Christmas rose for Esther. Eve's flowers, similar to the iris in Masuji Ibizi's short story The Crazy Iris, are crazy and belong to a crazy age. Ibus 1985-35. They do belong to a crazy age, but Eve is aware of the past, the ruins, and the wasteland. Unlike Belle who contributes to the devastation of Hiroshima, my seed reigned on that city from Black Clou, withering the camellia, curling the leaves of oaks, scalding the feathers of songbirds. My seed flowed with the inland tides, sweeping heaps of trout and salmon into pile among the rotting sea turtles BC26, and therefore perpetuates the waste by dismanting les fleurs du mal. Eve's seeds provide succor. Not only does Eve have a love of well-kept gardens, BC91, where even the stone wall bloom, BC91, but also she's got some kind of plant wall of this, BC92. Certainly, it is the best garden around since Paradise was lost, and it is the first one created by Eve Naylor. Work cited. The Bible and Culture Collective. 1995. The Postmodern Bible. New Haven, Yale University Press. R.Z. John. 1989. Hiroshima. New York Vintage. Hoyt Edwin. 1981. Pacific Destiny. New York Norton. IBUSE, Masuji. 1985. The Crazy Iris. In the Crazy Iris ed. Kenzaburo OE. New York, Grove Press 17 à 35. KROKER, Arthur and David Cook. 1991. The Postmodern Scene. New York, St. Martin's Press. Naylor Gloria. Belle's Café. 1993. New York Vintage. OE Kenzaburo. 1985. Toward the Unknowable Future. In the Crazy Iris ed. Kenzaburo OE. New York, Grove Press 9 à 16. Shelton, Sharon and Michelle Sellory said. The Critical Response to Gloria Naylor. Westport, CT, Greenwood Press 1997. Wittig, Moni. 1996. The Statement, Feminist Issue. In Feminist Literary Theory, second ed. Mary Eagleton. Cambridge, Blackwell 408 à 411. Ambiguous SPACESIMAGINARY Islands. In Gloria Naylor's Mama Day and Belle's Café.
Nous espérons que vous avez apprécié cet aperçu. Pour continuer à écouter ce livre audio sur Google Play Livres, utilisez le lien dans la description de la vidéo.